Big Chief didn't just race cars. He constructed something television had never actually seen before, a ranking system held together entirely by reputation, by handshakes, and by the understanding that when two drivers agreed on race terms, those terms were binding. The 405 list wasn't a written document. There were no lawyers, no contracts, no governing body recording the results. What held it together was a code, and that code only functioned because every person inside it agreed to honor what they said out loud. For years, it worked exactly the way it was supposed to. But codes have limits, and the limits show up at the worst possible moments, in front of cameras, in the middle of high-stakes events, or in the kind of slow, grinding split that takes years to become undeniable. Over the run of Street Outlaws, 5 people tested that code in ways Big Chief couldn't simply absorb and move forward from. Some of them did it publicly, some of them did it quietly. One of them had been standing next to him for over a decade before the damage finally showed. These are the 5 names. Richard Rawlings ran Gas Monkey Garage out of Dallas, and had built his name through Fast and Loud, the Discovery Channel reality television series that ran 8 seasons between 2012 and 2020, and generated spin-offs including Garage Rehab and Misfit Garage. By the time the mega race came together, Gas Monkey had crossed 20 million followers across social media, and Rawlings had extended the brand well beyond a television show. Restaurants, tequila, merchandise, music venues spread across Texas. Street racing wasn't his world. He was a commercial entity built around cars, and that gap in culture mattered the moment these two worlds were asked to meet on race day. The event agreement was clean. 2 teams, 2 cars built from scratch, no carrying over existing advantages. That framework mattered because the 405 had never needed a written rulebook. Terms were agreed verbally, both sides honored them, and that was the whole system. What disrupted it was a name nobody had discussed during the planning: Alex Laughlin. Rawlings brought him in to drive the Gas Monkey car on race day, and Laughlin's background included NHRA professional credentials and years of sanctioned drag racing experience. The crew learned about it during the build phase, and the pushback came immediately. This wasn't 2 shops matching up the way the challenge had been framed. One side had recruited a professional driver to sit in the seat. Big Chief laid out his position plainly, describing it as a violation of what had been agreed, not in the fine print, but in the spirit of the entire arrangement. The race ran anyway. Street Outlaws won. But Rawlings had altered the terms without consent, and in a culture where the spoken agreement was the only rule book available, that was the one thing you couldn't walk back. James Goad, known throughout the drag racing world as Reaper, came at the conflict from a completely different direction. Where the Rawlings situation had involved one specific agreement being broken, Reaper went after the structure of the 405 itself. Who ran it, how decisions got made, and whether the system actually operated the way its leaders claimed. He hadn't built his place on the list the way established racers had, and the 405 operated on the principle that position was earned through time and results. Reaper stepped into that environment and immediately questioned whether the people at the top were managing it fairly. These weren't quiet complaints passed between races. They happened on camera, during race nights, in front of the full crew, aimed directly at call-out orders, race conditions, and list management. The confrontations with Big Chief became some of the most visible arguments the show produced during that period. Direct, heated, and conducted entirely in public. Ryan Martin and Chuck Seitzinger had both questioned aspects of how top positions worked, but neither of them made it a sustained campaign the way Reaper did. Across multiple seasons, he returned to the same criticisms, refused to soften anything, and when cameras weren't present, he carried the argument online, posting statements that reached fans directly and kept the tension alive between episodes. His car, the Reaper SS, a turbocharged Chevrolet Camaro built with aggressive weight reduction and serious power numbers, had been genuinely competitive against the top 405 racers throughout his time on the show, which made his criticism harder to dismiss on performance grounds. Eventually, the friction with production and with the racing group reached a point where his regular appearances ended. Reaper moved into independent racing and built his own content outside the franchise, and that exit closed the longest-running open confrontation Street Outlaws had ever generated. Kai Kelly from Magnolia, Mississippi, never said a critical word about Big Chief or the 405 list. He didn't challenge the system, didn't go online with complaints, and never questioned how the Oklahoma City crew operated. What he did instead was line up against their best racers repeatedly and walk away ahead of them. And over several years, that turned out to be a more effective form of pressure than anything said out loud could have produced. His car, a Chevy Camaro called the Shocker, was built with one purpose: running the quarter mile as fast as possible, with nothing added for television and nothing kept that wasn't earning its place on the car. When he started matching up against 405 names, he didn't ease into it. The moment that locked his name into the conversation came at a Cash Days event in Texas in 2015. Cash Days pulled top racers from multiple regions, with real money on the line, and the field included some of the strongest names in the country. Kelly ran through it and walked away with roughly $16,000, and Big Chief was among the racers who couldn't match him that night, losing a high-profile open event to someone from outside the 405 circle, in front of competitors with cameras present, hit directly at the identity the crew had spent years building around being the fastest street racers in the country. Kelly confirmed the run of wins in later conversations, presenting it as a straightforward fact the results supported, not as drama, which made it nearly impossible to argue with. The 405 adjusted, more aggressive builds, sharper preparation, strategic changes that turned their matchups into some of the most anticipated races the show produced. A national audience had found Kelly through Street Outlaws, New Orleans in 2016, and his no-nonsense approach made him one of the spin-off's standout figures almost from the first episode. Precious Cooper had already established herself completely before America's List was ever in production. Racing out of Memphis under the mentorship of J.J. DeBoss, she had earned the nickname Queen of the Streets by consistently beating established racers in a scene that had no tradition of women at the top. She started racing at 19, competed regularly in No Prep Kings and Outlaw Armageddon, events that brought together the strongest names from across the entire franchise. And by the time the national show came together, her standing in the street drag racing community was no longer a question anyone was asking. The argument with Big Chief didn't come from a race. It came from a driver's meeting before filming had even started, centered on the show's new Race Your Way In qualification format. Reports described the exchange as heated, with Big Chief and Jackie Brosh both involved in the confrontation. Neither Precious nor Shearer gave a full public account of what was said, and both sides stayed largely quiet about the details afterward. What followed was that Big Chief walked away from the production, with some accounts placing his departure as early as the first night on location. In his public statements, Shearer pointed to broader disagreements, how rules were being applied, how the competition was structured, how production was managing the whole operation. He didn't name Precious as the direct cause, and she never revisited it publicly either. The timing, though, made the two events inseparable in the minds of everyone watching, and fans spent years filling in the gaps that neither person had any interest in closing. Sean Ellington and Justin Shearer had been working side by side long before Street Outlaws reached television. They co-owned Midwest Streetcars in Oklahoma City, collaborated on builds that became some of the franchise's most recognized vehicles, including the Crow and the original Murder Nova, and hosted a joint podcast called The Chief and Sean Show. When the series premiered in 2013, they were the backbone of the 405, and the audience already understood them as a unit. That shared history is exactly what made every crack in the partnership land harder than any outside conflict could have managed. The first public fracture came in Season 3, when Big Chief accused Sean of running nitrous oxide in a race that had been declared nitrous-free. That accusation wasn't handled privately. It happened on camera, inside the competitive structure of the show, in front of the other racers who all operated under the same rules. Season 6 brought a second accusation, this time involving a leave button, a device that helps a driver time a launch off the line with precision. Again public, again in front of the audience that had followed both men for years. Beneath those specific incidents, something slower was developing. Sean's focus was shifting toward hands-on restoration and classic car building, pulling him away from the competitive drag racing that had defined their shared operation. Shearer stayed on the racing side. By around 2021, the split was complete. Sean launched 187 Customs, rebuilt his public identity around the new shop, and stopped appearing alongside Big Chief at events. The branding shift from Midwest Streetcars to 187 Customs was visible on social media before any statement confirmed what it actually meant. After the split, Sean's competitive record held. In 2024, he secured individual wins and an overall championship in the No Prep Elite Series, then moved into the NHRA Outlaw Street Series, bridging the outlaw racing world he had always worked in with the more structured side of traditional motorsports. Shearer later described the end as two people who still cared about each other but had grown toward different things, and Sean never publicly contradicted that framing. But the on-camera accusations in Season 3 and Season 6, the deliberate rebranding, and the complete separation don't disappear because the ending was described without anger. Every other name on this list represented a conflict Big Chief could absorb and eventually move past. The Rawlings situation ended with a win. Reaper eventually left. Kai Kelly pushed the 405 to get faster. The Precious Cooper argument remained unresolved, but didn't pull anyone out permanently. Sean was different, because what they had built together at Midwest Streetcars was the part of Street Outlaws that no rivalry, no rule dispute, and no outside competitor could have ever replaced on their own.